Welcome, and welcome to the University of Macau, and on behalf of the Department of Portuguese of the Faculty of Arts and Humanities and Department of Communication, Faculty of Social Sciences, I am very pleased and honoured to welcome Christian Licoppe and Susan Danby. Thank you very much. Now, Christian is Professor of Sociology and Information and Communication Technologies in Paris Tech. And also welcome to Susan Danby, who is Professor in Queensland University of Technology in Brisbane in early childhood. I'd like to welcome you both. Thank you very much for coming as part of the first Macau Symposium on Methodology and Conversation Analysis. And we'll have a sort of conversation for 40 minutes, and then we'll open the floor up to some questions. The first question that I'm interested in is Susan, how did you get into EMCA research, and what was it about that attracted you?
I started in EMCA research within my PhD. So studying my PhD, I was reading widely in education and in literacy and in early childhood, and everything I read seemed so familiar, and I kept thinking, I want to find new ways to understand this world, these classrooms that I know so well. How can I do that? And then I met Carolyn Baker, and Carolyn was at the University of Queensland in the School of Education, and she started to feed me books and articles that really captured my imagination, because Judith Green was some work that she fed me, Peter Freebody's work, her own work, where she looked at the educational order in a way that I had never thought about. I'd never read about it. It was before. It was very much looking at displays of what people were doing, the social order, looking at how the social order unpacks, and it was so different to all the other work that I'd done looking at young children through psychological lenses and educational lenses. And I was really excited because I could see new things and new methods for how to look at that. So, as I was saying this morning, the first thing that Carolyn said to me is, get back into the classroom and video record, and let's have a look at some of the video recording. And that was the start of it. And I saw this episode that happened where there were 3 boys in a classroom, and there was some disputes going on, and a little boy started crying, and when children cry in classrooms, the teacher comes in, and then it looked at what was happening after that. And I took it back, and we had a data session, and we started to unpack this dispute that happened, and really started to look at what sort of social order exists for young people, for peers in classrooms. And it was such a new area that at that point there really wasn't very much within the early childhood field in that space that was being done by early childhood people.
You mentioned Caroline Baker, of course, is very famous Australian, as well as working in Queensland University, influenced a lot of the Australian focus on childhood and education research in the field. Can I just ask you more about the influences, not only Caroline, but also the way that the early work or the later work of Sachs, Garfinkel, or whoever, how they influenced your work and how they have influenced your work in up to the present?
So, the lectures in conversation from Sachs became my bedside reading. Sat beside my bed, and at night I would open it up, pick anything, and I would start to have a look at it, or I would start to flip through that very long index to try and find things. That was really, really important in terms of understanding that phenomenon was something that could be found every day, that everyday practices were things that people could do in a very insightful, intellectual way that didn't require the sort of formalized ways that people think about research. And I loved that. And I loved, when I was reading Garfinkel, again, this new way of envisioning and how to understand the world was incredibly useful. But some of the very early ethnomethodology books I really liked as well. So I think it was Jack Douglas's work.
Yeah.
I just love. I remember reading in his book the story about, well, it's called The Art of Walking, I think, and I loved that. I loved the way that this ethnomethodological description could work and could give you insight into these practices. And then, of course, Stephen Hester's work was very important, and he worked within the educational sphere as well. And to be able to, so his was really important to me. Peter Freebody's work was very important. Carolyn Baker's work was absolutely pioneering in education, and she brought together so many researchers who, up until then, conversation analysis was fairly unknown in Australia, and she built such a strong body of CA research and EM research in Australia that I think that tradition continues today as well. But there's always books, there's always conferences that you go to, people you hear that really spark thinking and further investigation.
I think we'll sort of come to the current influences.
Yes.
I think when after I wanted to turn to you, Christian, and ask you the same question: how did you get into MCA? What was it about? And also, what was attracted you to it? But also the early influences of people, places, and writings.
Actually, I came to it sideways. Initially, I got into social science for a PhD in history and philosophy of science, which was interested in, my PhD was on the experimental accounts, how people would describe experimental proceedings in the 17th and 18th century. And so I got interested into the issue of accountability and descriptibility somehow. And particularly because you may not know that 17th century, at the time of the scientific revolution, there was an emphasis on providing these experimental accounts that would be founded on the ability of the writer to account for the singularity of the setting in all its particulars, its particular details. And because that question was very central to 1700th century natural philosophers, and I wanted to dig a bit into that. That led me to people discussing accountability and descriptibility. So that led me to Garfinkel, that led me to the work, since it was work which was within the STS or 4S tradition. This led me back to Michael Lynch, which was also very influential in that domain. Because the problem I was addressing in this historical approach was how the natural philosophers were unpacking indexicality practices to provide legitimate scientific accounts, which is very particular to that time. So that was the first foray in EMCA. And then I had the chance to have a position to study the use of communication technologies, initially in the industry and now in the academia. And then I worked with Michel de Fournel, which was one of the first conversation analysts in France. It was part of the first wave of conversation analysis in France in the 80s. And so through him, I got interested in the way we could apply more conversational analysis, analytic practices and methods to the ethnographic study of how people would use technology in situation, which was another way I returned to MCA on the CA side. And afterwards, I got deeper into that.
So one of the things that really attracted me to EMCA as well was the way that students and supervisors worked in the space, where it was a very collegial space where people came together to look at data together, to analyze data. And I think that method of being introduced to a way of undertaking research was a very inclusive way and encouraged participation and an enthusiasm and passion that also contributed to wanting to undertake that sort of method.
I would go with that, absolutely.
And clearly, sort of working in ethnoethnology and conversation analysis, that area, it does seem to foster a kind of unique community. One might think that's a larger kind of community as well as different forms of the community, and I think that's going to be. So I'm interested in what your current influences are, particularly in your experience of working with the EMCA and the emerging new trends, especially new forms of phenomena, new forms of data that are coming in. So when we come up to your major influences, then, and you mentioned, Susan, that there's a lot of things around at the moment, and it seems to be a proliferation of this form of work successfully. And so, with the amount of conferences, the amount of publications, the amount of books, as well as just the amount of conversations that we're having, even over this weekend, I wonder what your current, or you can name some, or think of some current influences.
Okay.
That,
Sure. So I do want to name somebody from the past as well, who was hugely influential, and that's Matthew. I can never pronounce his surname, whether it's Spear or Spire. But he was, to me, absolutely critical because he wrote about childhood. He wrote about ways of understanding childhood and from an ethno-methodological position. And his work to this day, I still pick up his work and find it hugely influential in a contemporary sense as well. But the work that I've been doing more recently has been looking at children's helplines, children and young people's helplines, and then looking again in classrooms at peer interactions and social order, and also the ways that digital technologies have become part of the flow of everyday practices. And then most recently we've a project that's looking at medical consultations between doctors and families where a child is critically ill. So each of those people have brought particular bodies of literature. Each of those fields have brought particular bodies of literature to the fore. So if I think about the digital technologies in classrooms, people like Ian Hutchby have been hugely influential in that space. He wrote a book back in the early 200s looking at children and technology. I found that incredibly useful. Also his work on counselling I've also found really helpful, going back to the helpline work that we did. Others, the turn that we've had in the most recent years where we're now looking at the application or the transfer of some of the research we're doing into practice, I've found Liz Stokoe's work absolutely fantastic in that space, where I think she's given a legitimacy to us doing that work, and the method that she uses has been hugely taken up all over the world, and I find her work really inspiring in that space. The other work is the work that's being done around childhood and childhood studies, and there's a number of people. Katie Goodwin's work in that space with her participation framework has been absolutely fantastic, and she's also a person that I keep just going back to and reading all the time. And then of course there's the people in Sweden, Jakob Krondal, Ann-Carita Evelson, Helene Melander, Paul Arstad from Norway. Their work is contemporary. They're also working within the digital spaces. And so to have a contemporary peer group where we're working together, as well as reading each other's work and being informed by that, has been hugely helpful. I would also like to say that Charles Antaki, every time I see Charles Antaki on a conference program, I always go to his talks, because he finds a phenomenon, he tells you about it, he shows you, he tells you about it, and you walk out of that room after his session just knowing exactly what it was that he was showing us. And I think he's such a model of ways to really look for phenomenon and understand it, but also his way of presenting. I learn from him every time I watch him.
I think I will come back to the question of technology, because both of you work in quite sensitive settings, and so technology plus sensitive settings brings up the topic of ethics as well. But I'll come back to that in a second. I just want to continue with Christian to ask the current or the trends or the influences and the people and the sort of things that are contemporary influences on you.
I found that a difficult question actually, because of the structure of the field. I think one of the very big strengths of EMCA is its capacity to make new phenomena visible somehow. And so what I find is it's nobody is irrelevant in a sense in this field. It was so difficult to pinpoint a particular contribution, because if you follow your phenomenon, whatever it is, what you'll find interesting and relevant authors and researchers which have worked on similar things which we didn't know about. So what strikes me is the way the whole field can become relevant for you at some point. And I think it's a particular characteristic of the way EMCA is working, and so it's difficult to engage into a kind of naming because of that, because I think it would be unfair somehow to the whole community, because really I think one of the strengths is the way the whole community is trying to build together a new phenomenon. Okay, if you push me a little, you will push me a little. So I know you will.
Here's me pushing.
I could feel it. Let's say because I'm interested, as you saw this afternoon, since I'm interested into the articulation of visual practices and talk interaction somehow. Of course, I've been very influenced by all the people who developed, I'm not sure of the right word, let's say multimodal interaction. So as you mentioned, Charles and Candy Goodwin, Christian Heath, Paul Loff, and John Marshall with the whole King's College group, Lorenza Mondada and all the work on transcription, and there's a whole network of European, North European and European researchers working in that domain. Oscar Lindvall, Pentti-Alit, and Arnold Depperman, all these people, because they pay a lot of attention to this complexity of the way action may be composed out of different types of building block, and I think it's very important when you try to look at the way participants are articulating what they speak about and what they see in interaction somehow. So would put a little emphasis on that kind of work, and also because some of these people, not alone, but it's very true of King's College Group, Christian Heath, and others, they also have been trying to make bridges, I think, which are very interesting with human-computer interaction communities. It's people working on technologies, developing interfaces that are designed somehow to shape interaction, and so that makes it very interesting to establish a dialogue between that kind of community and the EMCA. And I think Christian Heath and Paul Loff, or Barry Brown and Stuart Reeves are doing a very interesting work to bring together EMCA and HCI, I think.
Thank you. So I'm going to now pick up on the technology thing, but also one of the things that you both have raised, and I think it's very important, is that much of your work and the work you mentioned in across technologies is engaging with different fields not in EMCA, and both in terms of you negotiating access and being involved with people you're involved with, both children and doctors and courts and defendants. It brings up this kind of idea of so we're moving into a much more technology kind of dominated. That's obviously truism, and EMCA is, in a sense, trying to come to terms with what kinds of data and phenomena we can now approach or look at or whatever. Now, these things have always been there, let's suggest, but there are new forms of data, more forms of data capture, and new phenomena that we are able to cover. So the first question is actually around ethics. Both of you have raised at different points in the conversations over the last day or so the issue of ethics and how ethics is starting to impact on the ability of EMCA work to unpack some of the sort of minor things. So Susan, could you talk about how, first of all, how ethics, your kind of take on what's going on with the ethics and your experience of it?
So I remember when I first started looking at data, I was shocked that there was this data that was being used that seemed to be in every public space. And I kept thinking about this very early data from the 70s that just seemed to be everywhere. And I thought that was hugely unethical. that this had somehow got out of hand. Something, I think that data had been kept, was supposed to have been kept within a small group, and it actually turned up everywhere, and people were using it all over the place. And I felt really uncomfortable with that as a practice. And maybe that's because I didn't understand exactly how that got into that space at that time. But I do remember thinking, I wonder how those participants feel about their data being shown and used all over the world, and in particular dinner, meal times and things like that. Images really come to mind around some of that data. So I have a very strong opinion that there has to be good ethical decisions made around any projects that we work with, any participants that we work with. We have to work from a position where everybody knows what the project is about. And I'm particularly interested in realizing that children and young people also have agency and should also have a say. It's not sufficient to have just adults speak on behalf of their children or in classrooms. That young people also have a say about their participation in projects. And I think people say, well, but they're so young, how can they have a say? They will have a say, and they will show you if they can't tell you. So in some of the early classroom data I did, if they didn't want you to video record them, they wouldn't tell you necessarily, but they would go and hide in a place in the playground where you couldn't get access to. And I think as researchers we need to be really sensitive to that. So there's the ethics of the formal aspects, but there's also the informal aspects in terms of being sensitive to our young participants in the study. I think the field has changed hugely. Sometimes the ethics, there's so much concern about risk in our society more broadly, that in many ways is now playing out in terms of the ethics forms that we have to have our participants complete. And sometimes I think it is so over the top that by the time the participants read these very long consent and information packages that has to list all these risks, it really isn't intended in the sense of the research and how ethics was originally meant, which was to ensure that participants knew how they were being participants in the study. So I think we have, in this continuum, we've probably gone from not having enough understanding to now really perhaps just going way over the top with this in terms of the risk business involved in it, where minimally, it seems to me at my university, sometimes it seemed to be more risky to be looking at Instagram images of children than it is to be giving them different sorts of medications or, testing different parts of their bodies. And it seems that there's been this change somewhere that somehow or other social science can be more dangerous than some of the medical work. But that's probably the fact that I've just come through an ethics application,
yes,
where the idea of asking children what they thought about something was considered really risky. And we were being told that we were going to have to go to a full ethics application, and it was asking children about what they thought about their parents putting images of themselves up on Instagram. So I think we've got to really look carefully at this and revisit it from that perspective. But you asked something else as well, and I can't remember the second part of your question.
Well, I think Christian will be able to pick up on that. It was about the technology and the changing kind of ethics in terms of vulnerability, which I think you did cover. But
maybe to pick up on something you said this morning, you had this lovely quote, a description of Sachs' work as being life as his laboratory. I think you were encouraging graduates and postgraduates to gather any kind of data they had.
Yes.
And I think that idea, which is I think very true, it's very true. I think it's very striking today, because I think today it's very difficult for us to take our life as a laboratory as it might have been for Sachs in the 70s in California. And I see three very different kind of threats about that. One is very banal. I don't have many interesting things to say, but we all knew about ethics reviews, review boards, and it's obvious that ethics review, one collateral effect of that kind of practice is to make some kind of qualitative research more difficult, particularly ours, and something we have to think about collectively, but we all know about that. Two things which are maybe less clear, one related to technology and one related to neoliberalism. I'm working on, as you saw, on courtroom practice, the introduction of technology into courtrooms. And the kind of thing I showed, remote witnessing, which is something relatively simple, it's really banal now, it's happening everywhere. It was introduced initially for neoliberal reasons, because it was costly to get people in the courtroom. And so the implication of that, and I think it's not limited to courtrooms, it's true in many kind of institutional contexts, is that because of neoliberalism and a kind of managerial efforts, people are, at least in the managerial position, are more and more discovering and make it clear that getting people co-present is something costly and that should be limited at all costs. And that can go very far in the case of courtroom interaction, because there's a reflection now on how could we use big data technology, predictive justice system applications, not to have hearings anymore, but to allow people to arrange their case through the technology without any kind of a hearing, and therefore without any kind of interaction. And if you go this way, that means that people are thinking that it's not so relevant anymore to have a kind of contradictory debate into a courtroom, and therefore that interaction itself might be not that necessary somehow. That emergent interaction, and we know it's something, that the idea that something useful might emerge from corporate interaction is something which doesn't go well with this managerial and neoliberal orientation, which is, I think, one threat which puts us in the middle of a political debate, because the core of our work, I think, is precisely to show again and again what the subtle things and actions that can be accomplished in an emergent fashion by people in interaction. And so we were directly, I think, with that issue, and some of the work we did on remote witnessing were clearly impacting a political discussion about whether you should have hearings and people interacting together in the courtroom, or you could do without that. And I think it's a big political issue. And the second threat, which is related to technology, I think is, I mentioned big data. I think one underlying assumption of big data research, and the idea that we should do digital research based on big data methods, is that you can collapse what happens in interaction. You can only deal with traces, various traces that was left by the interaction. And that a good research project is the treatment, the large-scale treatment of decontextualized traces of interaction, which can provide many interesting results. I'm not disputing that. But I think that a threatening ideology behind that is that you don't have to pay too much attention, after all, to what goes on interaction, once again, to the emergent features of co-present interaction. And I don't want to get paranoid, but I really think we should think very carefully about that, because these several reasons, they make it very difficult to recover what you described about sites that were going out and gathering all kind of data you have and be able to do research with that.
Thanks. I want to just pick up on a slightly different tangent, but it's not actually that different. And I think the experience of ethics is different in different places. Now, we are in Macau, in Asia, close to China, and the strictures for ethics are kind of different. Now, the University of Macau is a Western base, and so it has more stricter ethics thing. And so I'm trying to sort of think about the geographical regions we are working in. So, as we say, we're in Asia and Australasia, which has a kind of slightly different trend of interest, and it's kind of developed differently compared to, say, the UK or Australasia and possibly France as well. So I'm interested in what the what it's like working or experience of working in the different geographical regions you work in. What's the main influences? What are the main kind of things that are coming through there? Because I think there's some differences, and I think they're important to at least understand why and where they came from. Christian, have you got something?
I'm glad you got the first question this time.
I hope that you will let us edit that part a little bit. I don't know how far I can go.
You can go as far as you want, because we're going to edit it.
No, first, in terms of a French situation, we have a very particular and difficult to understand educational system, and which makes it that unlike what you have, most of you here, if you are a student, you get your PhD, that doesn't make you eligible for a position in academia. To get a position to academia, you've got to go one step more, which is to bring your PhD to a particular disciplinary commission, and these are done by disciplines, so sociology, anthropology, linguistics, and so on and so forth. And that commission will decide whether you, with your PhD and the kind of committee you've been able to gather, then you'll be eligible for academia. So that means that in France, there is a very, very strong institutional influence of traditional disciplines and mainstream disciplines. For example, for sociology, this kind of commission is mostly controlled by people coming from the Bourdieu tradition, which has very, very little interest in EMCA work. And in linguistics, from time to time you have someone from the EMCA tradition. I think Lorenza was in that commission 5 or 6 years ago, but right now there's nobody from the tradition. So that means that when you're a PhD student and you get your PhD and you want to find a position, which is a legitimate wish, then you have to find a way to get your work accepted by this disciplinary commission, and this is a very, very difficult exercise. And maybe the grass is greener elsewhere, but I think you don't have to deal with that in other countries. And the consequence of that is that to be able to pitch your PhD in a way that makes you eligible for academia, you absolutely have to convince some other community that your work is relevant. So you cannot do pure EMCA or pure phenomenology or whatever that might be. You have to be able to convince people that the kind of interaction you've been looking at, for me, in cultural interaction, that would be that it's relevant to people working in sociology of law, which is a big field in itself. Or for people working on technology, like we could try to argue for STS, which starting, so STS has succeeded in gaining some kind of established position. So, or in communication and journalism studies or whatever. But it's really something you have to do. And that kind of exercise, it's costly, I think. Of course, it can be done. And I encourage my PhD students to do that, but it's very costly. And that makes it a bit difficult, I think, in France for that kind of research to develop, particularly for young researchers in the current context. And I think maybe I tend to think our situation in France is a bit worse than what you have elsewhere. Maybe you have a different position.
Well, I think we're very similar in Australia, not so much in the way the PhD is managed, but with grant getting in Australia, where a similar thing happens to some of the major national grant bodies. The Australian Research Council, for instance, has a panel that people meet, and there are both expert peer reviewers within the field of that study, and then it comes to a panel that is hugely diverse in terms of expertise across different disciplines in the social sciences, different research traditions and paradigms. And it's a similar sort of thing where to get funding out of that body, you have to make a case that's going to be robust, to stand up to different paradigms and to different ways of understanding how research works. So it's much easier if you work within dominant paradigms very often. But I think that EMCA people in Australia are starting to get a real traction in the grant writing space because of perhaps lots of lessons learned over many years. But it is an issue, I think, more broadly about how EMCA sits within the broader research world. I think everyday practices. Perhaps it's because people think it's so mundane that it's not worthy of study, and yet perhaps it's the most worthy of all.
Yeah, but yes, both of your work just clearly demonstrates that that's not the case. I just want to put a couple more questions to ask, and one is picks up on the current state, but also sort of, okay, what do you see as some of the challenges for the future of the EMCA, not necessarily in your own regions or discipline areas of research, but just broadly, really, sort of, what do you see the kind of areas of challenge and of growth? Christian.
Well, I mentioned, since I'm interested in interaction and technology, so I think there's a kind of wealth of things that support and control interaction being developed by new technologies, and so I think if there is such a mediated interaction for various reasons, very careful mediated interaction. I'm not sure. I think any interaction is mediated, but let's keep it simple. Let's say interaction where various technological resources figure prominently. I think there's a lot of things that are appearing that are questioning somehow our notions of interaction. For example, I had the opportunity to work on maybe some of you know that kind of thing. Young people are using it a lot. It's called Periscope streams. It's live video streaming. So in that kind of stream, you get a streamer which appears in video and who's doing things, doing things, and interacting with an audience of unknown viewers who can only interact with her by messages which are public. They appear like a chat superimposed to video stream. It's a very strange situation. It's a situation where you've got someone which is embodied and available through sound and video, interacting completely asymmetrically with people reacting or responding to what she does through messages. And you get more and more this example of configuration with interaction is supported and constrained in ways which are more and more farther and farther apart from co-person interaction. And so I think it's interesting in two respects. One, it provides us with new phenomena because there can be some kind of practices that are developed in that kind of environment, which are specific to that environment, that have no equivalent elsewhere, but still central to a sequential organization of ordered interaction within these settings. And I think also because when you look at that, you can look at it in another way, as ways to question our tacit assumption about co-present interaction. And I think that kind of loop is very interesting around technology. And the other way, and I'll finish with that about technology, I mentioned a relation with HCI communities, which are more and more developing that kind of thing, from self-driving cars to interaction with robots to between human and artificial agents to all that kind of thing. You know, obviously you see there are obvious places to put the EMCA research. However, and I think there's really something to fight about, the HCA research community is really dominated by experimental and cognitive psychology. And I think there's really, we have something to say, and I think we really have to work hard to make the things we have to say about interaction to be heard against the kind of assumptions that underlie experimental and cognitive psychology, which run opposite to ours. So I think it's also an area of potential development. We have to fight for it, but I think it's really fecund for the future.
Mm-hmm. Susan?
I completely agree with what you're saying. In terms of other areas, I think in Australia there's been a really under-researched area, which is around multilingualism. So we have 1 in 4 Australian children who speak a language other than English at home. And that's pretty surprising. It's not something people know about Australia, that we have such a strong multilingual group of people, population. And so I think in terms of the way that Australian research needs to go in this space is to be much more within the looking at how that happens. The work that is being done really tends to come at it from a problem. This is a problem to be explored, rather than to say, to bring a competence-based approach to the data. So I think that's a challenge for Australian researchers in that space. I think the turn towards quantification of data is huge. In some places, people tell me in the USA, if you can't quantify your data, you're not going to get the research project. And so we've got these pockets of research that are just drying up because there's nobody there who can afford to do the work because they need the funding to do the work. So quantification, I think, is something we really need to both work with people who work in that space, to understand ways that we might be able to collaborate in a way that is effective for everybody. I think transdisciplinary research is something that we have to deal with and break down some of those silos. But at the same time, we can't, as you were saying, I think, Christian, we have to continue to be interested in the everyday practices, the practices of watching people in the street and the co-present aspects as well.
Thank you. I think obviously the area of multilingualism, I think, is obviously very prominent to us here as well around Asia, but also obviously in every seminar that I've ever been in. And I think that's it. And then the issue of multilingualism in technology or through technology, I think, is also, as we said, through Periscope or through, so in China we have WeChat as opposed to WhatsApp and these different ways. Thank you very much. I just want to finish up with one final question before we hand the floor to questions. And I'll start with you, Christian, because you've actually written something here. So I'll give Susan a bit of a chance to think about what this might be. So the question is, if you could go back to your early career self, what advice would you give yourself?
I think, I don't know if it's advice, it's more something I didn't do. I didn't have a chance to do it. I really like, if I had to do it all over again, I'd like to get that opportunity. It's related to the French situation. I didn't get into that when you asked about the French experience. But it happened in France, but there were two waves of researchers. There was a first wave of research in the 80s, which brought the EMCA tradition to France. Maybe people you know, Louis Quéré, Michel de Fournel, which studied information analysis, and Bernard Conat, which were the people who introduced actually the Manchester School. They went to Manchester and they introduced that kind of thing. And I don't know if they had a kind of falling over, but they went separate ways. So Louis Quéré went toward philosophy, Michel de Fournel studied information analysis, and Bernard Conat went to social cognition somehow. And the second wave of people, the one which is best known to you is Lorenza Mandada, they also, it was in the 90s, and they also went their separate ways. So there was never, because of this particular configuration, there was never a kind of stable community of researchers. And so for someone like me, which came sideways to these researchers, and in the 90s, the thing which I missed, which I discovered now, in essence what we've been doing here is this, is the benefits of participating within a community, doing data sessions and working together. And so my advice would be for students to do that as much as possible. And if it's not available for them as it was for me in France at the end of the 90s, to move away together. Because I think it's really one of the strengths of our communities. I think very important in formative years. I think. So it's that kind of regret would I highlight.
Thank you very much. Susan?
I agree with you that I think the community is really of researchers and being part of people coming together to look at phenomena and look at data is really, really important. And I can't stress that enough. And I think if people are time poor, that's something they should still absolutely make a priority, because we are a community and that's how we do our work, and we mustn't lose that. I think advice to myself, I think I would need to, I would have liked to have been braver I remember John Heritage examined my thesis, and I wrote to him afterwards, and I wrote a long time afterwards, and said, oh, you know, you examined my PhD thesis, and I just wanted to, and that was really hard for me to write that email. And then he immediately wrote back in his lovely way and said, of course I remember you, but I think I wasn't brave enough to make those links with international people and with people who are leaders in the field. And that's what I would say to all of you, to reach out to the community. I think we're a very supportive group, very much involved in working together, and to be brave and open up those lines of communication. And I think the other thing too, when I finished my PhD, I got a bit lost. I wasn't too sure what I would do next in terms of research, and I probably wasted a couple of really important years trying to think about where next. So I think that sort of thinking should be starting before you finish your PhD. So don't wait till you finish your PhD and then go, well, what am I going to do next? But as you're going along, there'll be serendipitous moments that hold on to those and see how that's going to influence what happens next in your research.
Thank you. We're coming to that. Is there anything else you'd like to offer or add at this point?
Can open to questions, I think.
Right, so I'd like to say thank you very much to Christian and Susan.